Hello, can anyone see me? Am I visible? Am I audible? I can see the live icon, but I can't see anyone. Ishan, have I clicked the right buttons? Am I on the right page? Um, can people see me here? Okay, looks like somebody has joined. Uh-huh. Is it working? पूछते हैं चैट पे. ओके, ठीक है. चलो, can you hear me? Am I audible? Just keep giving me this feedback, huh? Because the connection is a bit erratic, and because there's so many people are at home, that's why. Oh, okay, thank you, Venki, and thanks for joining. And somebody has asked me a question on chat. Okay, Srinivas, when is it going to start? It has started already. Okay. So Srinivas is on the page, I believe. So Srinivas, if you can see the, do this and you can. So I'm waiting for others to join as well. We just have 6 people right now, and I suppose a lot of people are supposed to join. Okay, great. Is Rehan Sahab here yet? कहाँ है भाई रेहान? Loud and clear. Thank you, Rajat. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, since the last Instagram live that I did Karma Heritage, I think my hair has grown longer. So, um, and it has become much more unruly. So, I am seeing posts on Twitter where people are saying that they have started trimming their own hair. So I'm not sure if I should do it, but I suppose another week from now, it'll be important for me to try something, maybe a trimmer. Okay. All right. A lot of lives are happening right now, no? So many people are here. Okay. So I have muted the connections. How many people are there? Is there a way one can track? Anyway, so what I'll do is I will not make this very long. In fact, actually, I got stuck with work, and so I was not sure until 10 minutes back if I can, actually come and do this live. But then commitment once made is made, so you have to honor it. So I'm here. Good evening, Faisal. We just have very few. So I'm just waiting for a few more people to join, and then already started. Karma Heritage. I'm also checking Facebook पे इधर चल रहा है कि नहीं. Okay, now 9 people have joined. That gives me hope कि 10 हो जाएगा. ओके, एक तो लाइव चालू है दिखा रहा है. आई सपोज वो मेरा ही है. Okay. Yeah, sure. I think so. I think so. Uh, yeah, इनका. Okay. Sorry, momentarily there was some loss of connectivity and it's back now. I actually clicked the wrong button. I wanted to mute my phone and by mistake I switched off the Wi-Fi. So apologize for that. So yeah, somebody is asking if the Facebook Live is happening. Yes, Pradyuman, it is happening. We are live. We are live. We are live. Happening right now. Chalo ji, we'll start. So the customary hello, so namaste and salam to all of you for joining this Facebook Live. Um, today the lockdown has been extended by another 19 days, so I suppose we are going to be stuck for a very long time. And with human interaction limited, uh, so there's absolutely no way of reaching out to people. Wow. And this is a good way of being in touch with people and having meaningful conversations, I believe. So today I'm supposed to talk about the Mughals and their understanding in modern times. So it's always a very fraught topic because today it is very difficult to talk about the Mughals without inviting hostility from some sections of the population. And I would say that it applies generally to all Muslim dynasties, but people by and large know very little about the Delhi Sultanate. So while they do have a vague idea about the cruelties of Alauddin Khilji and the eccentric mannerisms or experiments of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, but beyond that, they know absolutely nothing. So they have no idea about Sultan al-Tutmish or Ghiyasuddin Balban and all those people. So that's why they tend to go easy on the Delhi Sultans, not Alauddin, of course. But when it comes to the Mughals, this love affair is very intense. Okay, so they. It just flows very naturally. I mean, you would see that Babur, I mean the first Mughal. Okay, I intend to share that. I intend to share that, Ranavan. Thank you for making that note. So Babur is like the first of the Mughals, and he is today synonymous with Muslim subjugation of Hindus, and he is often associated with a mosque in Ayodhya which was razed, and his identity is just about that. People don't bother about his other exploits, how Babur was as a general or how he was as a father, as a husband, as a writer, as a traveler. So all these aspects are not important. So it's just one aspect which people are largely bothered about, and that's his association with a mosque, which finds no mention in his own memoirs. But anyway, so because the Mughals have to be vilified, that's why and they have to be used as a justification for hostility towards today's Muslims. That's why people are largely referred to as a pejorative expression is used, and that's Babur ki aulad. So it's quite common. And those of us who grew up in the 1990s when all that, all these right wing movements were on, so this used to be a very common phrase which we used to come across. So that's where the identity of Babur lies in today's understanding, at least in India. Okay, so then of course you have Humayun and Akbar, who are like they are like insignificant as compared to the scale of hatred that Babur and some other Mughals they get. So So Humayun is barely mentioned, and people have very vague ideas about what Humayun did. They just know him as the Mughal emperor who lost and was pushed out of India, but who came back and then had a miserable end. So beyond that, they don't know anything about it, and they are not bothered. Akbar is like nowadays, of course, he's also the bad boy of Indian history. So, but for a very long time, he was seen as the good Mughal, so the good emperor, and the great emperor, so who treated all his subjects equally. But now, of course, the modern understanding increasingly among certain sections of our population is that Akbar was a king who was very cruel to the Hindu men, but very naughty with the Hindu women. So that is what the whole identity of Akbar has been reduced to largely. Uh, and so if you have some questions, I would request you to put those out once I'm done speaking, okay? Because what happens is when I see pop-ups and then my train of thought is upset. So I'll take all your questions. I will be very brief today because I'll intend to finish my talk in 15 minutes. So after that, of course, I'll answer your questions and we'll have as many questions as you want. So about an hour we'll take, and then I'll try to cover as much as possible. So so that is the understanding of Akbar. Now, of course, among some people, not generally. Then you have Shah Jahan or Jahangir, and Jahangir is again forgotten as as the lover boy, who was in love with a woman whom he allowed to pull the strings of power, and as he got drunk and totally interested in the pleasures of life. So that's what Jahangir was. Shah Jahan was a romantic fool and a wasteful idiot, and who fell in love and built a tomb for his dead wife, and that was about it. So, and he wasted the riches of his empire in building these grand monuments. So that's what it is. But all the love is actually reserved for the sixth of the Mughals, the so-called great Mughals. So, and that's Aurangzeb. So Aurangzeb is like, you can never be right about Aurangzeb if you try to analyze him or analyze his reign without conforming to the black and white template. Then, of course, you are an apologist of Aurangzeb, you are a jihadist, you are anti-Hindu, and nowadays even anti-national. So this is what largely the identity or the understanding of the Mughals has become like. And among, of course, I'm talking only about the popular understanding. I'm not talking about the general, more well-aware people who are more aware of history. I'm not talking about their understanding. I'm just giving you why I had to write a book on the Mughals, and especially Emperor Akbar. So as I have to do it, and as every author has to do it, this is like mandatory publicity, self-publicity. So I have to put this up for you all to see. This is my book. It's called Allahu Akbar, Understanding the Great Mughal in Today's India. Now, thank you, Rana ma'am. So, I suppose that's an answer to Mr. Rajat. Okay. So this is largely the backdrop in which we find ourselves in, and that's where we will start our story. So if you have to insult the Mughals, then I suppose you don't really have to do too much. So you have to just keep on referring to them as the Mughals, and that will do the trick. Because in their time, the Mughals hated this term. So the Mughals, they called themselves the Gurkhanids, or the House of Taimur, the Nasl-e-Taimur. So Mughals as a term was a pejorative, it was an objectionable term for them, because the term is okay, ठीक है Anand, I'm sorry. I thought you were responding to Mr. Rajat. But anyway, thank you so much. The Mughals, in their time, they hated this term because the Mughal is a Persian for Mongol. Okay, so and the Mongols were considered to be very boorish, uncultured, deviant-natured people. So every civilized, ruler back in the 16th century or even 17th century, ulta dikh raha hai. Really, I thought I had placed the camera perfectly well. So In fact, it had happened with me last time. So at that time, my phone was horizontal. Now I have made it vertical. So last time it worked pretty well when I did my own Facebook Live. Um, Mr. Mukherjee, do you think you need to do something about your portrait and your layout mode? Yeah. Rana ma'am has the answer. So, yeah, please don't mind. I'm also getting some, messages from work, so I have to keep on. Um, yeah, okay. So, just give me a second. How did the term Mughals originate? Okay, so the Mughals were actually Mongols. It's a Persian word for Mongols. So, and the Mongols, and if you would see that, there are some old accounts of the Delhi Sultanate, for instance, I think it's the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri by Juzjani, Minhaj Siraz Juzjani. So, when you see the English translation, so it says the history of the Mohammedan. I'm forgetting the exact words, and it ends with "and the eruption of the infidel Mughals." Okay, so that's how Juzjani described them. So of course, the Mughals or the Mongols at that time were non-Muslims. When the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri was written. So of course they had to be called as infidels, like, and but eventually, of course, after they destroyed Baghdad and all, no, Abbasid Caliphate, they destroyed in about, I think, 1260. So Baghdad was destroyed, and 1258, 1260, that's the period when they conquered the Middle East. And after that, I think in 1297, you have the first Mongol ruler converting to Islam. And eventually, most of these Mongols converted to Islam, and many of them joined the Sultanate. Even during the time of the Mughals, there were many. When Babur comes from Central Asia, he comes with him Mongol archers. Okay, so they are like the neo-Muslims according to Barni and other chroniclers. So they become Muslims, and they are the archers who come with Babur, and even Akbar uses them. So that's the origin of the term Mughal, and the Mughals hated it, of course. So because they thought that it was equating them with the Mongols, who were like boorish people and uncivilized. And there's a particular instance when Jawhar Aftabchi, when he writes the book Tazkiratul Waqiyat. So in that he describes Humayun promoting him in office, and then Humayun cracks a Mughal joke, okay, and tells him that you should never become like the Mughals. So if you have to insult the Mughals, so they just keep referring to them as the Mughals, and your job will be done. So actually, they hated this term. And even if you go to Iran today, like Rana ma'am has been to, and you would find paintings and all that in Iranian libraries and palaces, and you would find museums and palaces, and you would find that the names for the Mughal emperors, in the names you have the word Gurkani. So because that's what they were, comes from the Turkic word Gurikan. Okay, so that means a son-in-law, because Amir Taimur, he married into the family of Chinggis Khan. Okay, and that's why he became a Kurigan, and Kurigan became Gurkhan in Persian. So that's how Gurkani, because they were the sons-in-law. So they were very proud of this fact. Just give me a second. I need to send. We are also working from home, and many of us are stuck at home, but still trying to bring out the edition. So that's what I'm doing as well. So just give me a moment. I'll just send. Anyway, yeah. So coming back. I will answer this question, Venki. So let me just before I forget what I wanted to say, let me just finish my part, and then I'll quickly take all your questions. Yeah, so they call themselves Gurkhanids or Gurkhanias, and the Mughals were also in that case very opportunistic. I'll just give you an example. So there you'd find around you there are people who are very proud of the fact that someone they know, it could be a distant relative, it could be a friend, has done very well in life. So that person is very rich now, very famous. So, they would say, that, oh, I'm related to so and so, right? But of course, they will not mention the others in the family that they are related to. So the same thing happens with the Mughals as well. So they say that, oh, we are related to Chinggis Khan, the great Khan, Khagan or Hakan. That's how he was referred to, the great Khan. But of course, they don't want to associate with others in the family, okay? So it's more Taimur, whom they are proud of. So it's always Sahib-i-Kiran who finds mention in their genealogies, and very rarely Chinggis Khan. So that's how opportunistic they were. Um, but Mughals as a term was used primarily by Westerners for them. That's why you have the term the Great Mughal, which comes from the Europeans. So you have Niccolò Manucci, who writes a book in the 17th century called Storia do Mogor, which means the story of the Mughals. And so you see that the term Mughal has been used by Westerners, and but in their contemporaries in India, they did not use that term. We don't see many instances when the term Mughal has been used. You would often find in Sanskrit or Hindi inscriptions the term Turashka or Turaka, or Yavana, if it's a very negative connotation. So Yavana means actually originally used for the Greeks, but eventually came to be applied to Muslims as well, and particularly the Mughals, so foreigners. But Turashka or Turaka is usually the common names that are used. And you would see that. Abu Zafar Sirajuddin Gurkani. So that's how they used to Silsila-e Gurkaniya. That's what I have read somewhere, that they used to refer to themselves as Silsila-e Gurkaniya. So it's when you say Silsila, you see an immediate Sufi connotation there. But there was a lot of Sufism in their practice as well. So they call themselves Silsila-e Gurkaniya. They were referred to as Turashkas. But you also need to see how their depictions were in those times. Okay, so when you talk about bad boy Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb is now primarily remembered for his atrocities on Hindus and especially the Marathas, right? And how do you see the past influencing the present? So if there is some crime which has happened, and there have been so many cases of lynching in the recent past, since 2015 onwards. You had Muhammad Akhlaq, or you had Pehlu Khan or Akbar Khan, and these people were lynched for their faith, or for allegedly possessing taboo meat. Now there was immediately social media outrage, right? And people condemned that. Many of us did, and they demanded answers from the government. And immediately, the people who were supporters of right-wing ideology, they immediately countered that by saying that, oh, what about Shivaji torturing Sambhaji to death? So now you have to answer questions about the past and the present as well. So the past is constantly used; it's invoked to justify modern things, and the past is used. So you are trying to avenge past insults in the present. So that's how the past, or the understanding of the Mughals, has been in recent times. But you would see that there are other things about Aurangzeb which nobody wants to talk about. For instance, there are songs that glorify Aurangzeb, and there's one particular song that I can recall by the Dagar Gharana. It's a Drupad, where Aurangzeb is compared to. So it says that whenever Aurangzeb mounts his horse, the earth trembles, and even the throne of Lord Indra, it totters in the heavens. And in another one, he is compared to the Kaliya Daman avatar of Krishna. So just like Krishna dances on the head of the Kaliya Nag, so that's how Aurangzeb also, whenever he mounts the horse, the whole Hindustan trembles. So this is how they were remembered in the past. And when you talk about Indra, so we see again in the case of Akbar's, right? So Akbar's conquest of Rajputana is remembered. It's like etched in memory, very deeply embedded in memory, actually, as much as Alauddin Khilji's conquest of Chittor and Ranthambore. Akbar's conquest of Rajputana is remembered, and you would find Rajputana at that time, 16th century and 17th century traditions, which say that even Lord Indra, he was trembling with fear because he thought that Akbar is going to come and attack him in the heavens. And then he's assured that Emperor Akbar, he understands the customs of the people and therefore he's not going to trouble Lord Indra in the heavens. So you see, the Indra thing is, this connection is there, very well established when you talk about the Mughals. So this also gives us the understanding that they were having these relationships with other states or other powers that I would not say most grants, but yes, he did keep temples. So when you talk about temples, you have to understand that there were a lot of temples that were destroyed. So there's no denying the fact. But there was also a reason for that. Temples always became, temples were a symbol. The particular temples became a symbol of power and authority of a rival king or a rival cult or a sect. So it was a political move to humiliate or show those rebels their position by destroying their places of worship, right? So if it's a Muslim king, he would by and large either destroy the idols or destroy the temple itself. If it's a Hindu king who is doing it, he will snatch away the idol and bring it to his own capital, right? So that's how that was the politics behind those moves. But at the same time, the temples which were there in the kingdom or in the empire of the emperor or the king, those temples were often safe because these were patronized by the Mughals. So you have to understand that. So when you talk about even Tipu Sultan in later times, he protected temples in his own territory, but he was very brutal towards temples that were there. Say for instance the Nayars in Coorg and all those places, or the churches there. So he did not spare them because he saw those people as allies of the British or his enemies. So that is the politics that you have to understand. And the Mughals did exactly the same. So they okay, so this is a good question that has come up. Anshuman Bora has asked if I could discuss the Mughal presence in India's northeast. Okay, so it has been given a communal color. So you have to understand that this communalism has been there in India ever since the British came over, and they gave. See, one of the thrusts of the British rule was also cultural, right? So you had to convince the people that A, they were the inheritors of the legacy of the Mughals, and B, they were better than the Mughals because they were liberating the Hindus from the tyranny of the Muslims, right? So this was the politics that they followed, and because of that, see what happens. We see today WhatsApp Gyan. Sorry, I momentarily lost the connection. So today when you see WhatsApp University, forwards, the Gyan that comes on WhatsApp, what happens? You have people who believe all these things despite having read books in their school that okay, so and so ruled from this part to that part and he was good or whatever, but people still believe in these forwards. And you have to remember that this was exactly the case with people in the colonial India as well. So because the British spread this propaganda that we have liberated you from the Muslims, and a lot of Hindus began to buy into that. So you see in the 19th century is the period which is, I find it very fascinating, and Swapna ma'am is watching this broadcast right now, so I'm sure she would agree that and because she's also researching extensively in 19th century India. So that's also my favorite period because a lot of things happen in that. So the British come, they put forward this theory, and people start buying that. So you have towards the end of the 19th century. So this Hindi-Urdu controversy which happens in the 19th century. Then towards the end of that, you have the Gau Raksha movement or the cow protection movement which happens. And what do? So they communalize completely the rule of the Muslims, but they do make an exception for Akbar, and they say that okay, they appeal to the British, the Hindus that is, or believers of the cow protection movement, that the colonial state needs to ban cow slaughter because Emperor Akbar had banned it. Okay, and that's also the period when these new theories start coming out, which are actually like modern. My connection is terrible. And yeah, so you have uh, um, can you hear me? My screen has gone blank. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay. Is this thing still on? Okay, ठीक है, cool, yeah. So, yeah, so a forgery, a forged document appears sometime in either in the 19th century or early 20th century, which is a will of Babur, in which he asks Humayun not to slaughter cows, not to offend the sentiments of the Hindus. So, you were trying to, people were still trying to use the Mughals and rationalize things by using their name. Okay. Thank you, Swapna ma'am, for the confirmation. Thank you, Ushan, Nana ma'am, Zahir Saab, all of you. Thank you. So, yeah, so this was done by the people back then, and even later we have seen that when we have seen the rise of Hindutva politics, we have seen that time and again the Mughals have been used. So if it's Namami Gange, which the present government started as an initiative after coming to power in 2014. So even for that they said that because the Mughals were very fond of Ganga water, especially Emperor Akbar, that's why we have to do it. We have to clean up the river. So the past is often used as a justification in these positive ways also. Okay, it's not that it's always used in a negative sense, but so in the subconscious minds, the authority of the Mughals, the spiritual image, or the image of the Mughals or the Mughal emperor as the spiritual head of the country. So that somehow has continued in the subconscious mind of the people, until very late in the 28th century at least. But we do see these, instances when these things keep coming back. So, and I have talked about this in my book as well. And when it comes to Shah Jahan, Shah Jahan is like somebody who you cannot ignore at all, because he's somebody who wanted, who had ambitions, and he also had the will to do whatever he wanted. So building something like the Taj Mahal or his other building projects, for instance, the Red Fort in Delhi, Shah Jahanabad, a whole new city. Akbar attempted building a city, Fatehpur Sikri, which he had to abandon sadly after 15 years. But the scale of Shah Jahan's buildings was much, much higher than any of his predecessors or any of his successors. So he was like the most successful. And we have seen, when I was in college, I would find these descriptions by different historians where Shah Jahan's period was called the golden age. You see, when you refer to ages like the past as the golden period, so there again you are understanding, you're using your present understanding to describe the past. And so this I find very interesting, because every time we do something, we write something about the past, our present always influences it. It always comes into the picture. So whether you are making a movie or you are writing a book, it could also be a popular history book, but it's again your present which is coming into play every now and then. And even if you want to vilify some people, so again your past is coming into the picture, your present is coming into the picture, your understanding, the present understanding of the past. So that's how the imagination of the Mughals has been. So they were a huge empire, and different historians have come up with different theories at various points of time, theories which were very current, very, very popular once upon a time, but eventually which were discarded. So you have something like the gunpowder empire theory. Like, so you have three empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire, who were like treated together as gunpowder empires, as if their existence solely relied on gunpowder or gunpowder weapons. So this was very popular in the West once upon a time in the 80s and 90s, Now, of course, it's no longer treated that way. So each of these empires were, histories to contribute, and they all had, their own uh, play in the history of the world. So, but of course, gunpowder was just one aspect of their empires. It was not the reason why they existed. Mughals. So, excuse me. About the Mughals. So, if you have your questions now, you can feel free to ask, or if you want me to focus on certain areas, Rana ma'am, Sapna ma'am, you're there. The experts are there, so they can always ask me. Uh, Radhika made a comment that Indra was of Greek origin in mythology. Maybe that was a connection from the general area. Uh, well, Indra, at least, when we talk about the 16th century or the 17th century, Indra was pretty much the Indra that we know today, okay? But of course, back in the past, far back in the past, in ancient times, the understanding of Indra was very different. So, Indra at one time was part of the Holy Trinity. So, there was no Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. It was Indra was like the main god, right? So, you had Indra, you had Agni. So, these were the gods which were like the Holy Trinity. And then eventually you had Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, So, um, so things evolved. By the time we come to the 16th century and the 17th century, the understanding of Indra as the king of heaven was. Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. The women. The women in all these empires played a very significant role. Okay. I'm responding to Radhika Khanna's question first, and then I'll come to Rana ma'am's part and Zahir Saab's question. Mughal women, most of the time we rely on Western descriptions of these empires. Okay, so if it's the Ottoman Empire or Safavid Empire, even the Mughal Empire, largely, it is the accounts of the foreign travelers, the Westerners, that are very popular. So even today, when people of right-wing ideology, try to demonize them, they always use these accounts of foreign travelers, Bernier, Tavernier, Manucci, and so on. So when they came and saw these societies, they were surprised in many ways, because the Mughal women, even though they remain behind the veils, and by the veil I mean in a very metaphorical way, that they were behind the scenes, but they were still they held significant power. So they owned merchant fleets, they had their own trades, and many of the times these women decided, or they held these dastaks, or the permits for trade, which were issued to foreign merchants. So, for instance, Jahanara Begum, she held Surat, the trade in Surat. So the British, especially the British, they had to go through her, right? So she was the one who gave them permission. So these women were very powerful. But for these Westerners, so they were not accustomed to this, to this idea of women playing central role in politics. So they painted, all these, created these, bazaar gossip, which they picked up, and their language skills were not very strong. So stories were twisted out of context completely, and there you have this image of the harem, the harem, which is like a scandalous place, a titillating place, So the men were, describing things that were happening in these, secluded spots, the zanan khanas, where all the women were like completely deprived sexually, intellectually, and there a lot of amorous tales would happen, and all these things, these were scandals of the time, which were publicized by these Western authors globally. But and even the honorifics were changed. So for instance, they were not accustomed to the idea that a woman could also be a sultan. Okay, so if you have Sultan Suleiman, and you have Sultan Suleiman, who is a sultan, and his wife, Hurrem Sultan, is also a sultan, right? So Haseki Sultan. and then you have Suleiman's son Salim, who becomes the emperor after him, Salim II, and then his wife Nur Banu Sultan, again a sultan, But the Westerners, they were so scandalized that they started calling them Sultana, as if it's a female version of Sultan, and therefore inferior a bit as the wife of that, because in their societies that was pretty much the role that women played. So Sultan became Sultana, okay, and there you created these new items, names, and similarly for instance Akbar's wives, Ruqayya Sultan Begum, not Sultana, right, or Salima Sultan Begum, not Sultana. But the Westerners, they twisted and changed it to Sultana, so as to suggest that they were different. And in the succession struggles, the women also played significant roles. So if you have Babur, so Babur's succession was facilitated to a great extent by his grandmother, Ahsan Daulat Begum. Okay, so she was the one who identified the enemies whom her grandson needs to take care of in order to ensure that there are no rival claims to his throne or to his legitimacy. And then you had Babur's daughter, Babur's sister, Khanzada Begum, who became like the Padishah Begum, or the chief woman of the royal imperial seraglio. So she was the one who actually secured the life of Akbar, and she also secured the inheritance of Humayun, because when Humayun was in exile and Mirza Kamran wanted to be the emperor, he wanted the khutbah to be read in his name. It was Khanzada Begum who prevented that. She said, "No, I'm not going to allow that." And there were other women as well in the harem who refused to do that. So this is what they were doing. And then we see somebody as powerful as Noor Jahan, and we know that Noor Jahan is the most famous example, right? So for a long time she was, almost an equal to her husband. So, and you see that in certain paintings where she is on the howdah of an elephant, and she is shot a tiger with a musket. Shooting down a tiger or killing a tiger was an image of royalty and absolute power. So if it's a woman who is doing that, so that means that she has to be a very powerful woman. So this is how the women were like. And even later times, so you have people like Jahadar Shah, who falls in love with somebody called Imtiaz Mahal, and she's the one, for a brief period she's pulling strings of the empire. Then Empress Lal Kanwar, so she's again she plays an important role in the succession of Shah Alam II. So these are examples that women played a very important role in the Mughal system. Okay, and even when you talk about Mumtaz Mahal, so Mumtaz Mahal accompanied her husband even on military campaigns. So they were sharing power in many ways. It's just that the society was patriarchal, so they had to fit into that. So, and their imagination or the imagery of these women was also very masculine. Okay, so they were fit into these masculine roles. So even later times, you see if you talk about the Rani of Jhansi, for instance. So Rani, you have absolutely no idea about her administration or her diplomacy or anything like that. What survives, the lasting image of the Rani of Jhansi, is of a woman on a horseback fighting the British, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. And you have that famous line, written by Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, "Khoob ladi mardani, wo to Jhansi wali Rani the." So mardani, so it's a mardana thing. So that's how the women were fitted in the grand narratives, and which is why we don't know many of their stories, except for some. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I gave a very long answer, but yeah, and it's on Karwa Heritage, not on my page. Then Pradyuman is asking, the British vilified the Mughals to serve their own interests, but not Akbar. Why the exception for Akbar? Akbar was somebody who amazed them, in the early part, at least, in the early part of 19th century, Akbar was this remarkable man, who was, gifted with boundless courage and had a very dominating spirit, and you had, a very daring person, and somebody who experimented with, different religions and, spiritual ideas and concepts, and, who essentially wanted, different factions of his subjects to, unite around his throne. So that was the imagination of Akbar. Towards the end of 19th century and early 20th century, the image started to change. And I had given the example of Beveridge and Vincent Smith in my previous talk. And so Beveridge described Akbar as cruel. And Beveridge, you have to remember, he's a very key figure in the understanding of Akbar, because he is the one who translated the Akbarnama, all 3 volumes of it. So Beveridge called him cruel, despotic, and somebody who was overrated. And Vincent Smith also say about Akbar. So, these people did not make that exception that their predecessors did for Akbar. And it is these people, who are today increasingly relied upon by communalists who, use instances like, for instance, the attack on Chittor and the slaughter of the garrison there. So these are, amplified and used as weapons against Akbar and the Mughals. So they exception really. It's just that they realized it a bit late that Akbar was also somebody who had to be vilified. I hope that answers your question. Okay, Akshat Agarwal is asking. Rana ma'am says there's no voice. Can you hear my voice, all of you? Just give me a feedback if you can hear my voice. Rana ma'am says there's no voice. Okay. Okay. Patronizing of other religions by the Mughals may be the pretend or to get authenticity to their rule from the people. Okay, so you see, they did understand, and not just them, even people they replaced, the sultans of Delhi, they all understood that in a country where there are so many different people of different, you have to have amicable relations with your subjects. Okay, you cannot be at a perennial state of war. So it was a pragmatic thing to do, to have this tolerant policy towards people of different faiths. Mughals not just tolerated these religions, they in fact embraced them, right? So they did not convert, of course, but they did marry Hindu women, and they did call Hindu Rajputs as their sons. For instance, Man Singh is referred to by Akbar as Farzand, Jane Baba. These are the terms that I use for these people. So you have to understand that they were not just doing this just for the sake of politics, doing this in their own lives. So you have to, and Akbar especially, so he was wearing the kaleva, he was performing home, yagyas and all that. So wearing the tika on his forehead, wearing the kaleva on his birthdays. So sadly, he also did not eat non-veg on his birthdays. So that's something I cannot really imagine. So at that time, you have to understand that that was, I think, a remarkable thing to do. And you always associate Muslims or Muslim rulers with meat eating, right? So the Mughals actually defied that stereotype. And I remember when Swapna ma'am and I and Rana ma'am, we were there at a session at the Times Lit Fest in Delhi, and that I had asked them about the kind of food that they ate. So Rana ma'am talked about Zere Biryan, and Shah Jahan was apparently fond of paneer in his biryani. You cannot meat. So if Rana ma'am remembers that, and Swapna ma'am might also remember that. So so this was, of course, I'm not saying that food is something that you have to play politics about, but that was pretty much a part of their lives. So yeah, there was a need. Definitely, I agree. But the extent to which they did things, I think that is not politics. It was much more than that. Yaku and somebody else had also asked something. if I can elaborate what prompted Akbar to forge relations with Rajputs. Okay, so there were strategic reasons. Okay, so Rajputana falls on the route through which war horses come from West Asia, okay, at that time. And there used to be a very large fair, a precursor of the Pushkar festival of our times, where all these war horses would be brought in by merchants, different merchants. And not just war horses, even English horses, European horses would be brought in um, by merchants, and these would be up for sale. And the Mughals, because cavalry was their trump card, okay, and in order to have their edge over other powers, it was very essential for them to have this constant supply of war horses. So they would get these Iraqi horses or the Arab horses and crossbreed them with their own Turkey horses, okay, which they brought from Central Asia. So there were grades of these animals in the military. So the nobles, excuse me, whether Rajputs or Muslims, like Irani nobles, Durrani nobles, Rajputs, these were like the premier nobles, the premier nobility of the empire, and so they would always ride these unbred, pure Iraqi horses or the Arab horses, and the rest of them would, other ranks would use these crossbreed horses. By and large, they did not consider Indian breeds to be good. Although Rajputs did use Kathiawadi and Marwari horses, but these were not considered to be suitable in combat. And so they needed these horses, and for that they had to control that region. So every step was taken to ensure that at least if they did not become part of the empire, they should at least not stop Mughal trade. So that's why it became important to have these alliances with the Rajputs. So you can't always have wars, right? So it's very expensive business. So they would have so whosoever joined them on their own or submitted to them were treated very well. Whosoever did not, the Mughals went hammer and tongs after them. So you should see the different treatment meted out to Chittor and Ranthambore. Chittor is completely annihilated, right? So the garrison asks to surrender several times. This is something which also makes for very uncomfortable talk in today's times. So you associate Rajputs with like unabashed, reckless bravery. There were people who would not submit. Pran jaya par vachan na jaya. That's the line which is very often thrown around, right? So the Rajputs, that's a very modern idea of the Rajputs, okay? But in their time, at least the garrison in Chittor offered to submit to the Mughals several times. Several peace missions were sent. The emperor made it a point that he would not accept any surrender unless Rana Uday Singh himself came and surrendered. So this was too much to ask. Okay, so we were hurting pride deliberately, the Rana's pride, the Rajput pride, whatever you might want to call it. So that's why the garrison decided to fight till the end. So which was actually, it's not very common in those times. So most of the time you would find, at least in the 18th century, you would find that many of the conflicts would be decided by just paying money to the garrison, because most of the time these garrisons would not be paid for months. So you just promise to pay them their dues, and you tell them that okay, we will allow you to go with your weapons and everything else, but just leave your treasures behind. And that's how the forts were conquered. So you should see that how the Duke of Wellington, the future Duke of Wellington at that time, Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley, how he conquered several of these forts in the Deccan during the Second Anglo-Maratha War. So many of them surrendered because he offered to pay them their salaries, which were held up for 3-4 months. They had not been paid, so he offered that okay, just surrender the fort, I'm going to pay you the money. And they said okay, we don't have any trouble with you, so just pay us the money, we will leave. So this is how things were back then. And so when the Chittor garrison was annihilated, because that was an important fort which stood on that route, so they had to conquer that. And Ranthambore was the other one. So what happens when Ranthambore, there's a month-long siege, and the king of Ranthambore, there was a Mehta Rajput, a Chauhan actually. Not Mehta, sorry, he's a Hada Rajput, Rao Surjan Hada. So he realizes that it's going to be exactly similar to Chittor. So he offers to surrender, and the emperor accepts it. So it's a very nicely done, elaborately done surrender where nobody's ego is hurt, and everything is done smoothly, and he becomes a part of the Mughal Mansabdari system, and thereby he joins the larger Mughal imperial system. So this is how their relations were. So both the carrot and the stick were used by Akbar, and these matrimonial alliances were actually bound the Mughals with the Rajputs strongly. Okay, so you could not attack your own Phupaji, right? Or you could not attack your own Mamaji. Or if you are going to war, then your Mama or Bhatija would be on two sides. So Mama and Bhanja, sorry. So that's how many of these states submitted eventually, because that was going against their own clans. So, and Mughals also became part of the Indian system that way. So they were no longer referred to as Mlechas. Okay, Mlechas was like, Mlecha is the Sanskrit for savage or outsider. So gradually, from the time of Akbar, this term was not used for Muslims, because they became part of even the Rajput system. So that's how the relations were with the Rajputs. And of course, eventually, after 1857, in the early 20th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, many of these states in Rajputana, they became embarrassed about their connections with the Mughals. So they started writing themselves out of the Mughal story by denying outright that they had actually married off their daughters to the imperial harem. So that's a different politics we can talk about at some other point. But yeah, so this is precisely how the relation with the Rajputs was like. And the Rajputs were a warrior clan, right? At least in the 16th century, their identity as a warrior clan had been established. Before that, we see them as Rawats or Ranas. There's no or Rajaputas, not Rajputs, Rajaputras and all that. So this was not considered to be a hereditarily endogamous clan. So it was just people who had a certain identity. Eventually, it became a clan system. So, but by the time Akbar comes to the throne in the 16th century, so you have that identity of the Rajput firmly established that way. So, yeah, hope that answers your questions, Srinivas. Okay. Scholars allege Akbar's religious policy as Akbar's liberal policy. I didn't quite get the question. Which one is appropriate? So, see, liberal, secular, these are modern terms, which are retrospectively applied on the 16th or 17th century rulers. So we have to, we should not fall into that trap. So these were kings who had their own compulsions and who had their own ideas about life, which were very different from ours. And Akbar believed in treating his people equally, because he was a paternalistic king. Okay, so he treated his subjects as his children. So he treated his subjects as his children. So when you treat your subjects as your children, so a father will not discriminate against people, right? So that's what defined Akbar's relations with his people. His religious policy, I'm not very comfortable with bracketing people according to their different policies. So there was never any uniform policy, right? So, but Akbar, it used to be old style where we would have the chapter on Akbar where we would treat all these aspects in silos. Akbar's Rajput policy, Akbar's religious policy, and so on. So there was never any one uniform policy to go about. There was always he was a pragmatic ruler, and he was pretty much a practical man in many ways. So whatever was suitable, whatever he deemed fit, he did. Okay. So whether it was tolerating people from other faiths, which he was not unique in doing that. There were many others before him who had done that, and there were many of his contemporaries who were doing that. Some sultans in the Deccan, for instance, they were also had these very eccentric manners, wearing the Rudraksh mala and coming to court and speaking in Marathi and not Persian in court. So all these things. And in Bengal, you had the sultans who were speaking in Bangla. They patronized Bangla as the court language, not Persian. So this is how the different rulers were dealing with their people. So yeah, there was never one uniform policy. But yes, when it comes to Akbar, we do see occasions when he did things which could be said that were objectionable to some faiths, people of some faiths. For instance, there are times when he banned prayers at the mosques. Okay, so that's something that he did. I don't think that's a good thing to do for any ruler, but yeah, Akbar did that. And he also made fun of people who would have long beards and had their prayer marks on their foreheads. So he would do things like that as well. So it's very easy to bracket people in silos, but I think that's how complicated people can be. There are great things about people, there are terrible things about people. So it's just one complete personality that we are talking about. So excuse me. So breaking their rule into different policies, I think, is pretty old school. We have moved beyond that now. I hope I could answer that question. Aurangzeb and Sikhs rivalry. Was this a religious battle that we are given to understand? That's a good question. They did have. It was, I think, somebody who has done more research on Aurangzeb would be a better person to answer this. I have a very general idea about this. Of course, if you say certain things, it can become problematic. Audrey Trusky has experienced this firsthand when she talked about the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur, and she just called it a law and order issue, and which may have been the case, but of course it was not taken very well by by the Sikhs, many Sikhs, not all, of course. But so, like I said, so it is your present which defines your understanding of the past. So what is your own relations in the present, the way you interact with different communities, your experiences of inter community relations, these tend to shape your understanding of the past. So this idea that it was religion alone that defined the conflict in the 16th or the 17th century, I think, is wrong, because religion used to be just one identity, one aspect of a man's identity. So there were several other aspects as well. So religion, of course, was invoked in the chronicles, of course. So if it's a Persian chronicle we are talking about, so you would often find that Lashkar-e-Islam, that's the term used, the Muslim army. Okay, so but the armies that actually went to battle were multicultural, multi-ethnic armies. So you would have Hindus and Muslims and Indian Muslims, the Turks, so many other people who would go to war for the Mughals. And so this Lashkar-e-Islam was actually a misnomer, but then that's again our modern understanding. But at that time, the glory of Islam had to be celebrated. So the Sultan or the Badshah was characterized as a Muslim ruler, in the chronicles at least. So they were described as such, and their conflicts were also given a religious tinge. So if the emperor is just fighting a rebellion, if he wins, it will be declared as the victory of Islam, okay, not the victory of the emperor. So that's what confuses many modern readers today, who think that these chronicles should be taken literally. But we have to remember that these chronicles were political documents of their time. Okay, so people were described, or people were legitimized on the basis of their faith. So they have so many instances when prophetic traditions were reinterpreted so that the emperor could be fit into that. Okay, or the Sultan was compared to prophets of Islam. Not just the last prophet, even the other prophets like Noah, Nuh, okay, or Ibrahim. So all these people, so you would have these examples of, or Musa, Moses. So you would have these instances when people are, for instance, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, when he goes to Gujarat and he loses his way, and then they are stuck in the desert and they run out of water and the army suffers greatly, and suddenly there is rain, okay, and he emerges out and leads his army out of that, and he is described as compared with Moses, Moses leading the people out of Egypt and out into the Holy Land. So that's the description that was used. So these are political documents. So it was just a bad move on the part of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. He got stuck in the desert, and his army suffered. They were misled, and eventually they got lucky. They managed to come out of that, and but it was glorified as a prophetic tradition. So that's how these documents were. So that's why you have to understand that what often appears as a religious conflict may not have been that the case back in the past. And Adil Shah referred to as son of Saraswati indeed. And then you have people like Alauddin Hussain Shah, who's called Goreshwar and Nripati, and I'll share one very interesting thing, which I have mentioned in my book. So you have, when you talk about the bad boys of Indian history, who are the bad boys? Immediately one name should come to your mind, and that is Mahmud of Ghazni, Mahmud Ghaznavi. There's no bigger bad boy than Mahmud of Ghazni, and because he's the one who destroyed the Somnath temple, right? So that's how we remember him or his campaigns. So when Mahmud comes in one of his campaigns and he defeats one ruler, and then he issues a coin. So what is the legend that is written in the coin? So it says that Avyaktam Ekam Avatara Muhammada Nripati Mahmud. So Avyaktam Ekam means the inconceivable one, which is God. His avatar is Muhammad, and Mahmud is the king. Okay, so you cannot imagine today somebody explaining Islam or calling the Islam the prophet of Islam, the last prophet of Islam, as somebody who is the avatar of God. Okay, so I think that you would be accused of kufr if you would do that, if a Muslim would do that. But it was possible back then. So because the idea of the whole identity of Islam was also very fluid, So the Islam that we understand it today, it was not so back then, The Islam was still an evolving religion, and that's why so many Mongols and people who did not really have very complicated cultures, that's how they converted large scale into Islam, because it was a faith that was very easy to follow, So there were very few rituals that were involved. It was very easy to follow, and it did not make too many demands from you. So if you have that in mind, and then you try to understand Islam today, then you would be completely at odds, because today the understanding of Islam is very different, but back then it was very different. So that's how it was. Image of Aurangzeb that exists today as a religious bygone, how much of it is true? It is true to some extent, but not to the extent that people or the right wingers would want you to believe. There were things that he did because of religion, and I'm not sure if you can call him a bigot, but certainly he was an orthodox person. So he did things which he thought would appeal to the more powerful sections of the nobility, and we have seen even today, right? So it's the orthodox people tend to have more power, and people who go against the tide, the rebels, the revolutionaries, they don't have much power because they don't have many patrons. Because the powerful people who have power, they are always tend to be orthodox in their beliefs, conservative. So Aurangzeb was conservative, not as open-minded as say Akbar, but he was not definitely not a cartoon villain that he's made out to be today. So I hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Rana ma'am says that he was also fond of bharta. Even I am fond of bharta. Bharta is something, no? So you see, the Mughals also had, they were very Indian, so you should stop looking at them as foreigners, because Babur was definitely born in Farghana, and he did not accept India to a large extent, because he wished to be buried in Kabul, and that's where he lies. But the rest of them, everyone else, they made this country their home. So they are here, they are buried here, and we have lived with them with their memory, with their legacy for centuries now. So we should stop seeing them as outsiders. Many of our food and fashion habits we have inherited from them. So that's how I think we should look at them. Uh, okay, Karthik Kumar was asking about the economy. Okay, uh, they were rich. See, I am a bit skeptical about quoting figures, uh, GDP figures to say that they were so rich and they were great economists. So of course it was a rich empire, which is why the name of and fame of India spread far and wide. Okay, so some people I think like Angus Madison have said that the Mughal Empire, the GDP of India in 1701 was like about 25% or 23% of the world share. So not GDP, but the world trade share was like 25% of international trade. I don't know. I haven't done much research into that, but I do tread with caution when it comes to these, because you can never prove things because it's all assumption, right? So um, yeah, and in between I missed what Sapna had written, that the later Mughals, Akbar Shah II and Bahadur Shah, also saw themselves as peacekeepers between Hindus and Jains and Muslims. Absolutely, they did. The British failed miserably at that. So yeah, completely agree. And Sapna ma'am's book on 1857 is also coming. Hopefully, we'll get to read it soon. So many of these things I'm sure she's going to tackle in that. So okay. Okay, Mughal presence interest in the northeast. Okay, so you had also asked a question on the